Now, I'll post this video in August, though I'm filming it a few weeks earlier, and I wanted to talk about the Battle for Normandy a little bit more. Now, while this ties in with my novel Hill 112, which is about the experience of young British soldiers in the Battle for Normandy on D-Day and afterwards, hopefully this is of interest more as well to just those who are interested in history. And it's a little bit like the talk about Waterloo. It's trying to evaluate the different armies, how they perform, and understand the battle and the military systems rather better. So the theme for today is to look at the performance of the Allied and the German armies in the Battle for Normandy. But posting it now in August is meant to be a reminder that June the 6th is D-Day. That's when the landings occur. That's the dramatic moment, the bit that gets commemorated. But the Battle for Normandy lasts until, well, depending on your dating, perhaps the 20th, 22nd of August. A lot of these declarations of when a battle finishes officially are fairly arbitrary. It takes 2.5 months. You have very heavy fighting. D-Day is the dramatic bit, but only a minority of the soldiers to fight in the Battle for Normandy fight on D-Day itself. Most arrive later on both sides, and the heaviest casualties, the heaviest fighting occurs in the weeks and months that follows. And this prolonged attritional slogging match before the Allies are able to break out, led by the Americans with Operation Cobra in late July, that starts to open out what had been a static front before that. British and Canadians start to make more progress. From that time on, you end up with the encirclement of a lot of the German army and the Falaise Gap and the escape of the German army then. So it takes 2.5 months before the Allies win the decisive victory in the Battle for Normandy, break out into France and are able to move before August is out to reach Paris. Brussels follows quickly, that incredible turnaround in the fortunes where you're suddenly dealing with, wide-scale German retreat. You lead on to September and Market Garden and all these operations, pattern around Metz, all this sort of thing. Everyone's gone a long way. You've had the second landing in southern France. Operation Anvil has occurred before Normandy is over. Things have changed dramatically. There has been a tendency, there was criticism at the time in the newspapers, a lot of bickering between the senior Allied commanders, a lot more post-war in various studies that argued that it all took too long. The Allies should have broken out sooner than this. And there was clearly frustration. The airmen, for instance, their point of view was that they needed space within the Normandy battlefield to build airstrips so they could deliver better, close support for the Allied armies, but not enough space was taken quickly enough to do what they'd planned. That, it takes a month, just over, to take Caen, a city that was one of the D-Day objectives for the British troops landing there. Much of this comes back to Field Marshal Montgomery and the various strong, impassioned, vitriolic opinions about someone who had a difficult personality and no lack of self-esteem, and put his own view of things that was often a little bit economical with the truth. So you had this broader argument that, well, it should have happened quicker, so what went wrong? And some of it focuses around that higher level, is it Montgomery? Doesn't he know what he's doing? What about his senior commanders? Sometimes extends to the American ones as well, but particularly focuses, remember, Montgomery was in overall charge of ground operations until more US armies are activated, Bradley moves up, and Eisenhower arrives to take direct commander, supreme commander in the field. And Montgomery just goes down to being an army group commander. That's not really the debate we're going to talk about today. We want to look more at the armies themselves, and that's something that has developed more recently. And I think particularly you have books like Carlo D'Este's book on Normandy, which is very, very good, is critical of Montgomery, at times extends this to the Allied armies, perhaps particularly the British and Canadian armies. Max Hastings, in his book Overlord, which I think was out in '84 for the 40th anniversary, very much argues that the German armed forces, both Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, were markedly superior in almost every way in terms of tactical performance, equipment, all this sort of thing, obviously not in terms of the morality of their cause, to the British, American and Canadian troops, the Allied soldiers they faced, and that this draws upon a lot of work done by the US Army in the 60s, 70s, trying to quantify, trying to understand combat, military effectiveness. Dupuy and people like this, whose study of the Wehrmacht argued that they were consistently more efficient than he tended to focus mainly on actions against American troops rather than British and Canadian, but extended this more generally, that they were simply better than the Allies, that the Allies won because of weight of numbers, weight of material, but that the German tactical system, the German training, the German equipment was more efficient and tended to kill more of their enemies than they suffered casualties themselves. And you have these comments that whenever the Germans meet the Allies on anything like equal terms, the Germans invariably won. Hastings develops this idea and pushes it. Others have followed to various degrees, but there's also been the backlash. I think starting in America, then I think the Canadians particularly championed their own forces, and by extension sometimes the British, and by some British authors as well, to argue that this isn't as true, it isn't as simple, and that the Germans were often clumsy in doing things. So that's really the question, is how much truth is there in this idea that the Allies may have won overall, but that they were not as good at fighting, not as good tactically, not as good in terms of equipment, doctrine, training, motivation, battlefield skill, effectiveness in the end, as we come to, than their German opponents, even at this stage of the war, 1944, when the Germans have been slogging for a long time, have suffered very heavy casualties to get where they are into this position. I mean, you come back to that comment that whenever the Germans meet the Allies on anything like equal terms, there's obviously an artificiality about this, because the whole point of warfare, particularly modern warfare, but actually for much of history, is not to fight the enemy on equal terms. And if you start to criticize someone saying, oh, well, they've got, better weapons than us, more air power, better tanks, better support, more of them, more artillery, all this sort of thing, but we're actually better men, we're better soldiers. If it was just down to, sheer merit, sheer courage, sheer skill, we would win. We were only beaten because the odds were against us. That's a nice consolation. It's I suppose, almost the Confederate, the post-war, lost cause myth that, oh, well, you were better at fighting, but we just couldn't win because the numbers were against us. It's, of course, what the Allies had been saying, particularly the British, for their early defeats in the war. We lost because the Germans had air superiority, better panzers, better doctrine, this sort of thing. And, of course, this is one of the dangers, is that the root of a lot of this, not all, comes from these post-Second World War studies by the Americans in particular, but NATO more generally. And this was a NATO that from the 50s onwards was looking at the Warsaw Pact forces and thinking, well, we might well have to fight these. Who has fought against a Soviet army in recent memory? Oh, let's go and ask the Germans how they did it, lessons they learned, what went right, what went wrong, all this sort of thing. And they hired lots of former German senior officers in particular to write studies of different aspects of the campaign, particular actions that were then translated and were then distributed around staff colleges and the like to give an idea. And obviously that's a very sensible thing. There's a great danger in any war that when you win, you think, well, we won because we're just great. We're better than the enemy. We must have got everything right, so we don't need to learn. That's obviously a great danger. From the point of view of the losing side, there were plenty of German officers very keen to emphasize two things. I think the first was that, well, we lost because of Hitler. This Bohemian corporal just made all these stupid decisions, wouldn't let us crush Dunkirk, wouldn't let us rush onto Moscow, diverted us to the south, and so on and so on. If he hadn't made all these decisions, then the brilliant German general staff would have won because we were just great and we knew what we were doing. The other one comes into it that feeds into that sense that we were better soldiers, we were more professional. It's partly a personal pride thing. And one of the reasons why they were good soldiers, like any good soldier, they believe in themselves and they believe they are good at things. So it allowed lots of former German senior officers to say, well, man for man, we were better. We only lost because of Hitler, and then we only lost because the Allies had this weight of numbers, weight of material, industrial might, mechanized warfare we simply couldn't match, and therefore we were beaten because of that. So it comes back to this, well, we did everything that any human being could do. It just wasn't enough against those sorts of odds, but we were better than you. Now, there's a lot on the German side. It's a personal pride, professional pride, and, it comes back to that good morale. You have to believe in yourself. And also, the Wehrmacht had such spectacular success for the first few years of the war, and there were actions where they did well later on as well. But the point is they lost. But there's that sense that, oh, well, we only lost because of circumstances beyond our control. You also have to be a little bit careful in that for a NATO audience, they wanted to hear the lesson that quality could beat quantity. Because they looked at, in the Cold War situation, the Warsaw Pact, modeled these invasions of Western Europe, and came to the conclusion very rapidly that the Russian army was a lot bigger than the NATO armies were ever going to be. They would have more tanks, more men, more guns. And that formula of more tanks, more men, more guns had got the Soviets to Berlin in 1945. So, how are you going to stop them in 1955, 1965, or so on? The Germans were telling them that if you hadn't had all these stupid strategic decisions from Hitler, if you'd actually just let the general staff be the professional general staff that they prided themselves on being, fight in the logical, efficient, Teutonic way, then the Wehrmacht consistently beat far superior numbers of Russians in a tactical sense, even if it couldn't win the strategic victory, let alone the grand strategic victory. So that it was what you wanted to hear. Again, it's quality trumps quantity. So that if you have better equipment, which NATO was confident with its technological superiority it ought to have, and if you had better training, better communications, better command and control, you could be a much more flexible, supple, sophisticated force that could take on and defeat far superior numbers of clumsy Soviet tank columns and this sort of thing. And it fed into lots of stereotypes with some basis in reality, but some exaggeration. But it was what NATO wanted to hear. So you have to remember that it's not so surprising that everybody bought into this. This was a message, this was singing to the choir. You definitely wanted this to happen. You wanted to believe that you could turn NATO armies into forces that could defeat significantly larger Warsaw Pact, Soviet-style forces and hope to win, as long as you had the right mechanisms, the right doctrine in place. So, you were looking at the way the Germans had done things and trying to say, well, that's actually worth copying, we can do that. And there was a strong influence, and it would even extend. It wasn't any great coincidence that post-Vietnam, when the US Army redesigns its helmet, you get the Fritz style that looks German. And it has practical advantages, it's a good helmet. But it's a little bit like dressing your people as Frenchmen post-Napoleon, Zouaves, and this tradition, this idea that you can somehow sort of, take on the virtues, the strength, the ability of the winning side from before, almost by dressing like them, by acting like them. So that's part of the context of this that has influenced the serious military studies that have then influenced the popular histories of Max Hastings and people like that. So those arguments then get pushed even further to the point where it does strain things a little bit. And some of the sweeping generalizations looked at closely don't seem so convincing. So that's really the context of this debate. And we'll try and look at actual performance of the armies in Normandy to judge how far this is fair, how far it's not, how far it's an exaggeration. Should we adopt the attitude of, oh no, our lads, our boys did really well, and this is just unfair. This is sort of, you've created this mythological, all singing, all dancing Wehrmacht that you're trying in NATO to reach an impossible standard because the Wehrmacht wasn't like that, and it made far more mistakes, and quality didn't always trump quantity. And the key point is that you've got to remember at all of this, the Allies win the Second World War. And yes, there are all sorts of, there's the industrial basis behind that, the production capacity, populations, all of these things. But that's easier to say with hindsight than it was in the summer of 1940 or 1941, when things were not looking so great. And the Germans did succeed spectacularly for such a long time. Again, you get, people like Hastings did this quite well. They did try and set the tactical descriptions, the descriptions of the battlefield within the context of this much bigger strategic, economic, industrial picture. It's something that James Holland does terrifically in his books at the moment, the sort of the big war and the small war, that he combines the stories of the two, of what's happening at that very highest level. And that highest level is clearly very, very important because it determines how big the armies are, what they're equipped with, how well they're supported, the wider situation. But I'm not interested in that so much today, other than its implications for what happenings in the small war situation, the tactical element of it. That's what we're really concerned about, because it's all very well talking about the fact that your industry has been able to produce all these quantities of artillery pieces, tanks, whatever it might be. They're not all there in one spot at the time. Where you are as an individual, you experience things in a rather different way. And that's what we're more concerned about at the battalion level, brigade level, divisional level, this sort of thing, and lower, and the personal level. So again, there's lots of good stuff talking about aspects of this. And again, with James Holland's books, he's very good at making it clear it isn't as simple as that, and there can be really tough fighting even when the bigger picture is that the Allies have all the advantages. And of course, a classic case is the Battle of Britain. Looked at realistically, particularly with hindsight, it's very hard to see how the Kriegsmarine could have mounted and supported the invasion of Britain against the still very, very formidable Royal Navy, with or without control of the air. But again, with hindsight, that's easy to see. You could see the difficulties involved at the time, but you don't have full information of the enemy's real capacity on either side. And it is wrong to think of this as one-sided, that Fighter Command was bound to win, because you look at the attritional rate, the loss rate, even compared to, yes, they've got big advantages compared to the Luftwaffe, nevertheless, they are being ground down, and the attacks on airfields in later August, early September, before the switch in targeting more to London and elsewhere. You could have wrecked that system, and again, the political will, yes, we think Churchill isn't going to quit, and that was how he inspired the nation, but what's happening in the rest of Parliament, what's going on? Again, the odds were much more in Britain's favour than perhaps it seemed to many people in the summer of 1940, but that didn't mean it was inevitable, and it didn't mean it was a walkover, it didn't mean it was easy. And the same is true that, by 1944 you think, well, the Allies are going to win the Second World War, they're just outproducing the Germans. That doesn't mean that the Normandy invasion was going to be a success, and that you even have, the famous telegram that Eisenhower prepared in case D-Day failed. People are really thinking these are real worries. So today we're going to be looking much more at the lower level, the smaller picture, the efficiency of the armies once they're there, and less on the background of how they get to be there, how the production industry, all this sort of thing works. That'll come in now and again. It is, however, worth emphasising just briefly how the armies have got there. So Germans are defenders, let's start with them. This is the 5th year of the war for Germany, and the Wehrmacht has borne the brunt of the war. The Wehrmacht, the land forces, and including the Waffen-SS that's developed by this time in that, the bulk of resources go for there. The Luftwaffe has been marginalised, it's never got quite the manpower. In fact, a lot of Luftwaffe personnel are being transferred to field divisions or posted. You're getting people who are posted from the Luftwaffe, from the Navy, to Waffen-SS divisions to serve as infantry or in whatever capacity by this time, because The Air Force is very much on the back foot, desperately trying to defend Germany against Allied bombing, and is being bled dry through that. The Kriegsmarine has been reduced to coastal raiders and the U-boat force, and that the Battle of the Atlantic has turned against them, which has made D-Day possible. Compared to the British and the Americans, the Germans devote more of their key resources to the land forces and to their army. You know, they never develop a strategic bombing force, as the British and Americans both do, that takes huge resources in numbers of personnel, but also in quality of personnel. You know, lots of your best and brightest volunteer to be aircrew, but are also needed for all the technical aspects of making these big machines work and keeping this functioning. That's very, very expensive when you think that any Lancaster by 1944 is carrying 2 different types of radar on it, just the standard one, not a Pathfinder. This is an ordinary aircraft. The level of technology, ingenuity that has gone into producing these very sophisticated weapons of war. The British Army has been left behind, the US Army to a fair extent has been left behind, hasn't really had the attention of the Navy and the Air Forces to do that. In contrast, the Germans have got a much bigger share of what was going on. But that's, of course, largely been because the army has played such a fundamental role in the German war effort. It was the army that brought the victories in France, the Low Countries in 1940, then in Greece and the Balkans. It's the army that pushes into Russia in Barbarossa in 1941. You know, the Air Force is there to support. The army does the bulk of the fighting. It's staggering to think that on the Eastern Front, the Germans have already suffered over 2 million casualties before any Allied soldier lands in Normandy, 1944. So the German army has been fighting, but also bleeding on the Russian front. Yes, you have the commitment to the desert, relatively small scale, though more troops are pumped into Tunisia. And it's probably grand strategically a mistake that Hitler puts too many important resources there when they might have been of more use in Russia, where things really mattered. So that comes back to the, well, without this fool in charge, we would have done better. More is pumped into Tunisia and then lost, then Sicily, then Italy. Although they engage large numbers of Allied troops and resources there, nevertheless, a lot of German troops are sent to both, particularly to Italy, and the quality of the divisions to go there is generally pretty high. So that, again, these are troops who could be better used elsewhere. And even the garrison troops that are controlling the Mediterranean islands and this sort of thing against threats, or in the Balkans, they could be used elsewhere. So on the one hand, the Wehrmacht has paid a very heavy toll in lives, in killed, in wounded, during the years when Allied participation in land warfare has been limited. Yes, there's been the strategic bombing campaign, yes, there's been the war at sea and all this sort of thing, but they're not fighting. And even when they're fighting in Italy, this is small scale, even compared to what's coming in Normandy, let alone the Russian front, which is just on a grander scale again. And ultimately, during the course of the war, far more German soldiers will be killed by the Russians than they will by the Western Allies. That's the basic arithmetic. And Operation Bagration, the big summer offensive in 1944, will inflict heavier losses on the Germans than the Normandy campaign. There's some argument about the figures, but I think, generally speaking, the pattern bears that out. And there is a difference which doesn't matter so much for the course of the war, though it does for the fate of the individuals. German soldiers were far more willing to surrender, or at least survived surrendering, on the Western Front than they did in Russia. So the proportion of captured, there's quite a lot encircled that are listed as missing in the summer of 44 during Operation Bagration. But other than that, fewer people surrendered in Russia because it wasn't thought of as a very likely survival option, whereas they did think they had a good prospect if they were captured by the Americans, the Canadians, or the British, or anybody in the West. Operation Bagration succeeds in part on the scale it does because German reserves are in Normandy rather than waiting in Russia to probably not defeat the offensive but blunt it. It might not have gone quite as far, and that's been the whole point. Stalin's been asking for a second front for years because reasonably enough, he feels that the Soviet army has been bearing the brunt, because while the German losses have been appalling in Russia, the Soviet losses have been even worse. And, you know, if you look at the catastrophic casualties they suffer in 41 and even 42, it is staggering to look and think, well, the Red Army does actually recover well enough to get to Berlin in 45. That's a remarkable achievement. It's one of the reasons why it may sometimes lack tactical subtlety, because you've just lost so many experienced leaders and people have had to step up quite a few levels far quicker. That's, you know, before you get into all Stalin's purges and all that sort of thing. So the achievement, the role of the Soviet army in winning the Second World War can never be played down. It is huge. And the grinding down of the Wehrmacht makes D-Day possible, in that if they hadn't suffered all those losses, there would have been too many well-equipped, well-trained German troops in the West for the Allies to mount a landing by sea and expect to win the war in the West. I mean, it works both ways. Normandy is easier for the Allies because the Red Army has ground down the Wehrmacht in the previous years. It's also easier for the Russians to succeed because you've had the strategic bombing campaign. Finally, when you do have the fronts in Italy and then particularly in Northwest Europe, then a lot of the pick of the German troops, and that's the thing we're going to emphasize again and again, a lot of the German troops to fight in Normandy, particularly in the first month, 6 weeks, are from prestigious, very well equipped, very well trained divisions. Though not always as ready as they might have been. You know, again, we'll come back to that when we get there. So the German army has bled in Russia. It's lost a lot of its best men, its best leaders. On the other hand, the survivors have a lot of experience, and compared to the British, the Americans, the Canadians, there is a chance, even in relatively poor quality German units, that an awful lot of your NCOs and officers are combat veterans. In a way that simply, you know, we didn't have. And they seem to be willing to keep fighting with more determination. Now, perhaps this is the growing sense of threat to the homeland itself. So you're defending Germany more directly. It's also the sense that you got far more severely punished if you broke down or, you know, didn't perform well in the German system than you did if you were British or American or Canadian. You know, the German army shoots an awful lot of its own people during the Second World War, far more than the Allies, and for, you know, combat failure, cowardice, all these sorts of things. You know, they have these large punishment battalion system, all of this sort of thing to deal with it. So, you know, this is a nastier regime that will be a lot nastier to you if you don't keep fighting. So you have a lot more experience, a lot more motivation, and it does mean that you've been able to test out your equipment, your tactics, your way of doing things, and learn on the job far more than the Western Allies. Fewer people have got to serve in North Africa and then in Italy. So there is an advantage in experience that is spread over more evenly across the German troops that will come to Normandy. They are, on the whole, led by quite experienced officers. They include some veterans at lower levels as well, depending on the unit. But again, we'll come back to that in a moment. So the Germans are more experienced, and their equipment, their doctrine, their tactics, tried and tested to an extent far greater than is possible for the Allies. The Allies are playing catch-up in land warfare throughout the war. The British Army in 1939, again, is the weakest of the three arms. The Navy is stronger, the Air Force is stronger. The Army has been spread out around the Empire, but it's been the lowest priority for resources between the wars. So, you know, that's why instead of adapting things like the Merlin engine that are used for Spitfires, Lancasters, lots of the famous aircraft, to drive a tank, which you could have done, British tanks are powered by bus engines that are modified and tend to be very unreliable. They're backward in a lot of respects, and you haven't had big maneuvers, big training. Many of the lessons of the First World War, the combined arms fighting of 1918, which the BAF had developed and then excelled in, particularly some of the Canadians, Australians, groups like that, but others as well. The use of tanks, all this sort of thing, close air support. Nearly all of that's been forgotten between the wars because nobody thought there was going to be another big war. And then you've had all the, it's been sort of H.G. Wells' predictions of what it might be like and, emphasis on gas, strategic bombing, all this sort of thing. The army's been the low priority. The army wasn't so essential for defending the island of Britain itself and was scattered around the empire doing various things. So the British Army has had to grow and has had to learn painfully how to fight a modern war against a modern opponent rather than lead a punitive expedition on the northwest frontier of India or something like that, which is a military problem that is a very difficult one, but is a very different set of rules and tactics and doctrine. It's also, of course, and it's something that is mentioned quite a lot by Alan Brooke and others during the war, many of the people who should have been the senior commanders of the Second World War died in the First. Britain and the Empire suffers just under 1 million casualties in the First World War, and they are disproportionately heavy in certain groups, and your regulars in particular got killed or wounded early on in the fighting. So again, that's hard to quantify because that's a what if. What if this hadn't happened? Would you have had more able commanders later on? But it's something to consider. You've then had to learn, and the performance of the army has been rather poor in the early years of the war. They're chased out of France in 1940, they're chased out of Norway in 1940, neither operation goes well. Dunkirk is an evacuation, but an evacuation of manpower, losing all your equipment. When the Japanese come into the war, Hong Kong falls, Singapore falls, with a huge and embarrassing, humiliating surrender of large numbers of troops that outnumber the Japanese attackers. Malaya will fall. Before that, yes, you've managed to beat the Italians in late 40, early 41, but when Rommel arrives, he chases you right back to Egypt. You've intervened in Greece, that's failed. You've tried to hold Crete, that's failed. Tobruk you hold in 1941, but surrenders embarrassingly easily in 1942. It's interesting, if you read the novel The Cauldron by Zeno about Arnhem, this is written post-war by a man in prison who obviously you feel half wishes that he'd actually fallen in the war when there was a purpose to it rather than faced afterwards. But he emphasizes a lot this sense of, there was just a lack of spirit, that people shouldn't have surrendered in those circumstances. His main character, you feel it's the author's view, that you did have these highly committed soldiers, but you also had others. Again, it's something that frustrates the Japanese in particular, but even the Germans comment on, is that when British and Americans and other Western allies surrendered, the prisoners still acted as if they were absolutely sure that their side would win in the end. And that was always a bit puzzling for these martial groups that were emphasizing their own courage, their own supremacy, their own greater worth and this sort of thing. Anyway, that's an aside. But the British Army hasn't done so very well. It's won in the desert eventually, but it's won through overwhelming numbers and resources, which doesn't diminish the achievements of the troops there, but that was what was required. And the Americans were none too impressed by the British record in the desert because Montgomery just waited till he had overwhelming advantage and then sledgehammered his way through in a sort of First World War style battle at Alamein, which is not too far from the truth. But you've learned how to fight in the desert, and then you've learned how to fight in Tunisia and a little bit Sicily and Italy. Northwest Europe is rather different. You've brought back a few divisions from the Mediterranean, none of which perform quite. They're expected to do great things. It doesn't quite turn out that way, at least initially, although the 50th in particular does well. The 51st does eventually. And the 7th Armoured Division, it has its bloody nose, but it performs reasonably well. But there was clear resentment amongst many of the men brought back, feeling that they were being asked to go and fight again, when others had sat on their backsides in Britain polishing their boots and weren't required to do anything. Why couldn't they kick a turn? I've done my bit. That browned off sense. This is a conscript army. You don't have the surge of volunteers you'd had in the First World War to enlist and join up and fight for Britain. Everybody just waits for their call-up paper to come, or most people do. There are more volunteers for the Air Force in particular than for the Navy than there are for the Army, or people where they chose where they were going to go. And a lot of that army has spent years training, peeling potatoes, polishing boots, doing all these, these mundane tasks the army finds for you. Browned off being that familiar expression. They're just fed up. They don't like army bull. They've been ordered around. And this is a generation, these are the children of men who, if they came back, told stories about the Somme and Passchendaele and the appalling losses in France, and as they saw it, the wooden-headedness of senior officers, the poor planning, poor command. They don't have quite that naivety, that faith that the innocent generation, if it were, of sort of 1915, 1916 had possessed. They know what happened as a result of that. So it's an army that's trained a lot but doesn't have much experience. And some of the experience it has is a bit jaded. Some of the experience it has, particularly from the desert experience, also proves to be inappropriate for a very different landscape, a very different military problem that you have in Northwest Europe. So the British army that goes into Normandy is not that experienced. Some of it is a little bit stale. It may have trained too long. It's also reaching the limits of manpower. And before the Battle of Normandy is over, they have to start breaking up whole divisions, let alone individual units, to provide reinforcements, replacements for existing ones. You know, the British Army has reached its peak and everything is downhill now. And that's reflected more generally that on D-Day there's some sort of parity between British, Canadian and American troops. Overall, as the battle progresses, more and more Americans arrive and there just aren't as many British and Canadians left. So the British are running out of manpower, and you're finding people from anti-aircraft batteries are being redeployed to infantry. Now, the Germans are obviously doing exactly the same thing. They're sending sailors, they're sending Luftwaffe ground crew off to the army, and sometimes they perform exceptionally well, sometimes less so. So, everybody's starting to scrape the barrel is a little bit perhaps unkind, these individuals, but you haven't got the pick of the bunch as your main teeth arms, your infantry anymore. The Canadians have problems that are just as bad, though in a slightly different zone, because they don't have conscription for overseas service on quite the same scale. But they're also breaking up units. And again, you're finding ACAC gunners and people like that are starting to find themselves in the infantry because nobody's prepared for the scale of losses in Normandy. So the British Army is a little bit stale. It's inexperienced, and it's had to turn around from the defeat in Dunkirk. It's had to be trained, equipped, organised pretty much from scratch since then, since 1940. And some of it's gone off and done things to sometimes well, sometimes not so well elsewhere. It's all there's an element of being cobbled together, of still catching up. And tank design, tank production, there aren't enough British tanks to go around without American supplies of Shermans predominantly. There would have been far fewer British armoured troops in Normandy. There are more American-made tanks with British crews than there are British-made tanks with British crews in Normandy. So you have a lot of problems, a lot of catching up, a lot of a sense that this is the least favoured of the armed services, the least glamorous. But nevertheless, you still have the military tradition, the regimental tradition that is passed on to a greater or lesser extent to the conscript soldiers. Some of them buy into it in quite a big way, some less so, and helps to create these bonds, these regimental families, battalion groups that help for morale. So it works, but in a way adapted to that society. But they are fairly inexperienced. And a lot of the doctrine, because of all of this, they've had to create battle drills, training methods that emphasize taking lots of raw material, people who would not normally be in the army, and teaching them basics. And it has been a little bit simplistic, and it has perhaps been a little bit too rigid. And you're trying to turn them into good junior officers, good NCOs, good soldiers. And you will run out, particularly of your leaders. There's never quite enough to go around, particularly as these men tend to suffer disproportionately high casualties. The US Army, it's a similar thing, perhaps an even more dramatic situation, because if you look at 1939, the US Army is tiny and very poorly equipped in terms of modern weapons. 1939, really, you've only got about the equivalent of 3 divisions that are anything like organised in the entire US Army. Now, 3 divisions are what lands on D-Day, just in the first, the initial landings you've got. So it shows how the US Army went from being tiny to being this immense organisation in just a few years. And it's a tribute to the organisational capacity, the industrial capacity, that they were able to do this, to clothe, to equip, to feed, to train, to form all these units. The Germans overestimated the number of divisions that would be put into the field because they thought they'd pare them down. The Americans provided far more support supply than the Wehrmacht possessed. Again, remember, an awful lot of the Wehrmacht units outside the armoured divisions still have horse-drawn artillery and transport in 1944. It's a very different world. But the US Army has had to go from tiny to immense, and lots of people, you have the spectacular promotions of, well, obviously people like Eisenhower and Bradley are prime examples, but plenty of others, the divisional commanders, the regimental commanders, people are reaching these posts far quicker than they ever would have done before, and not all of them prove up to the task. And it's not really surprising because it's a heck of a jump to make. The emphasis is very much, whilst you do have parachute divisions or airborne divisions, you have smaller units like the Rangers, you have a few elites, but on the whole the emphasis is on sort of mass production of a decent quality, rather than the German way where you have clear gradation, sort of pyramid of your elite formations to your men that by 1944 you've got some where units are being composed of men with particular dietary problems or hard of hearing, this sort of thing, stomach and ear battalions, this sort of thing. Again, reserved for coastal defence, static defence, not expected ever to attack anybody, ever to manoeuvre in the open, but nevertheless you're using these people who would have been in the Home Guard in Britain and rejected by the army altogether in America. But again, the army had tended to be less of a priority for the United States because there wasn't really any prospect of a land threat. You weren't going to be invaded in a big scale by Mexico or Canada or anything like this. The Navy was important. The Navy copes better, still increases immensely, but it's they're able to learn quicker and benefit from, they had some better things in place already. The army's having to pick it all up as it goes along. And then in many cases early on, it's just as you're making better, newer tanks, they're being sent off with Lend-Lease to Russia or to Britain to plug the gaps in the creaking alliance and keep the war going. So all of that takes time, and it's noticeable that there are certain divisions in the US Army that seem to do pretty well on the whole, and others that apparently have been formed by exactly the same system, exactly the same material at all levels, and just don't perform. It shows that human element that the difference true leaders make, and that you can't always tell who they are until they're in position. And luck as well, good fortune. If a division, if the units within it get some breaks, they have some early successes, rather than they're thrown unprepared into a really difficult situation and suffer a bloody nose from which it's hard to recover. But you do find particular units will then, in that military way, because they perform better, they get used for the most dangerous tasks again and again, so they do get worn down. I mean, it's the 1st Division joke that the US Army consists of the 1st Division and so many million replacements. It's that idea. So you have good units, you have poor units, and this is true in any army at any period of history. That human element, the same system, the same society will sometimes produce exceptionally good and sometimes poorly performing units, and nobody can quite tell why. You can just see the end result. In the same way, this is true in any institution, any organization. You get the really gifted leaders, the really gifted administrators, organizers, technicians, craftsmen. They have an influence on those around them, and if you can get a few of them together, it tends to just raise performance all round. And also, the people who are not good at this, but I think they are, can have a similarly adverse effect. The US Army will mainly commit inexperienced divisions to Normandy. You've got some like the 1st Infantry and a few others who've been brought back from the Mediterranean, but on the whole, most will be inexperienced, and as I say, some will perform really well, some will not. You've had to do just what the British are doing, but even more so, try to simplify things, to almost make a production line of how you recruit people, equip them, train them, prepare them, organize them, prepare them for the various roles. That's harder, and it's harder the higher up you go. It's hard to produce lots of good captains. It's even harder to produce lots of good colonels, lots of good generals. And so some fail. Some do not prove very good. Some of the administrative systems, the support systems prove very poor, particularly as the Northwest Europe campaign progresses, the replacement system, you know, the Rappel-Dappels, depots for recruits being posted to unit, that system is felt to be flawed in many ways, doesn't put people into a situation where they're likely to settle in and cope and last long enough in an infantry unit to be capable. There is you can see the influence of priorities, and again, this is something Max Hastings develops, that when they had a study in late 43 or 44 and they discovered that on average infantrymen in the US Army were an inch below average height of men within the US Army. The infantry had tended to be a dumping ground, not the priority. Your best, your brightest had not gone there. They start to reverse that and try and do that, but it's a little bit late. Now remember, these are children of the Depression in many cases, so a lot of them are a bit smaller than their parents had been anyway, because they just haven't fed as much at a vital age. And there isn't the basis of experience. Even Britain, with its small wars, has more experience of some form of combat than the Americans had. And at its higher command level, because the US Army was only involved intensively in the latter stages of the First World War, even though it then suffered casualties at the very high rate that everybody had been suffering them for years, you had people like Eisenhower who'd not seen any active service but could rise to the very top, and plenty of others. And the service of those who had seen action was relatively limited. But again, that was the situation compared to, you haven't got the whole corps of staff officers that the Wehrmacht has been creating since its revival in the 1930s, drawing on this doctrine that has emphasized that training for command, the length of training for officer training for staff posting and all this sort of thing. So the US armies had to learn as it's going along, and whilst it's expanding at a staggeringly quick rate. So again, it's rather amazing how much was achieved so quickly, than surprising that not everything was perfect, not everything works as well. Some things tended to be neglected. The infantry tended to be neglected, infantry training tended to be neglected. For both the British and the Americans, there was so much emphasis on D-Day itself and the landing that what was going to happen afterwards tended to be neglected. In particular, and this you find a lot of, particularly in the American accounts, that people were surprised by the bocage country and felt that there should have been some preparation, some training, instead of having to work out doctrine to how to fight in the hedgerows as you went along, which is obviously terribly costly in casualties. And people said, well, actually, a lot of our training areas were in Devon, parts of southwest England, where some parts of the country are not so dissimilar, at least they were then, that perhaps we could have thought about this. But again, that's expecting the Allies to do everything. Remember, in terms of equipment, that the 76mm Sherman has arrived and been sent to England months before D-Day. The US Army tests it, decides that actually it doesn't need it, that a tank's job is mainly to support infantry, for which the better high explosive shell of the 75mm Sherman is more effective. It also has less of a muzzle flash, so it makes you less of a target, less obvious. And we didn't want that. They would change their mind during the course of the Normandy campaign when they discovered that they were outclassed by a lot of German armour and that they needed the more powerful gun. The British have only got the Firefly in the weeks, months before Normandy. People are being issued with new kit they haven't got to use very much beforehand. So there's a lot of improvisation, and there is also, again, D-Day we tend to take for granted as this invasion. We've got this vast fleet, we've got all these landing craft, and it's successful. We forget how much people really obsessed on that and how big a challenge it was, and how if that had been a failure or a disaster, then the whole campaign is set back probably until the next year, because you can't replace losses of ships, material, landing craft quickly, but also the weather will go by the time you have done that. So if that failed and people were willing to believe that it could, then the whole course of the war is set back a long, long way. So you have to emphasize, you focusing very, very heavily on making that extremely difficult part succeed. And then the backup, because everything else that's going to fight in the battle for Normandy is going to have to get there by sea. And it's going to be ferried back and forth. So all the fuel, all the ammunition, all the men, all the equipment has to get there across the English Channel somehow or other. So it's not surprising really that they do focus on D-Day itself and the landing and somewhat neglect what's going to happen afterwards. The other thing, we're coming back to big picture stuff, but strategically up until now, when you landed in Sicily, when you landed in Italy, whether at Salerno, whether at Anzio, the German reaction was some counterattacks immediately at the beachheads in that area, and these could be quite intense, but once those had failed, they did not try and fight you mile by mile, but they prepared defences some way back, pulled back to those, destroyed bridges, destroyed the communications network to slow you down getting there, fought you at that line of defences, bled you dry, and then pulled back to another line of defences and another. They had not, as they would do in Normandy, stuck in position and fought a static battle for weeks and turning into months. So that wasn't what people expected. They thought that they would be able to push on much quicker than they actually did. So some of it was the Germans not playing by the book, that the rules they'd followed up until now, which surprised everybody. Some of it was the focus on D-Day itself, and that difficult thing that you knew had to succeed, because if that doesn't succeed, then nothing else is going to work after that. That meant that you neglected training, thinking about infantry combat tactics, how you deal with the blockage, how you do with all this sort of thing. That was just assumed they'd be able to cope with that people would manage. It wasn't priority, and you can't do everything. And again, with hindsight, it's very easy to see that these were mistakes, but anyone with sense will realize that this was perfectly reasonable, understandable, and the most likely and probably the most sensible way of doing things, of preparing. They only had so much time, they only had so much resources, they focused on what they thought was most important, and they were probably right to do so. It just means that there are problems as time goes on and as the campaign develops. It's worth having a quick look at equipment, which is a big theme in the Max Hastings argument, that the German equipment was in most cases superior to the Allied equivalent. There is a fair bit of this, although yes, you have to be careful and put this in perspective. But if we look at small arms, generally speaking, the rifles, submachine guns, that sort of thing, there's not a huge difference. Each side seems to have thought that the others were better. And the Germans were rather fond of using captured Sten guns, which, it looks so crude when you see the thing. The M1 Garand was certainly superior to the Mauser carbine or the Lee Enfield. It was more modern and had a quicker rate of fire. Again, you could argue that, well, rifle fire, particularly at any sort of range, played a relatively small part in the fighting in Northwest Europe. When it comes to the section weapon and above, then the Bren gun, the BAR, or various versions of the Browning that the Allies possess have a much slower rate of fire than the MG42 that was now the staple of German infantry, both for the section weapon on a bipod and for sustained fire, the MMG roll on a tripod, for which the Allies had the, British had the Maxim gun, the Vickers gun, developed from that had served through the First World War without really, like the rifle, it was pretty much something that hadn't changed since early on in the century, but worked, did a good job, was very reliable. The Americans have the 30 caliber and small numbers of 50 caliber Browning, mostly air-cooled rather than water-cooled, but both there, which were good functional weapons. You have the MG42 has a much higher rate of fire, and that's emphasized again and again in the personal accounts. It was not accurate. A Bren gun is actually quite a precision tool, and many former British soldiers are very fond of them for that accuracy they could get, the ability to hit the target again and again. But do you necessarily want that for a suppressive fire weapon? In terms of spraying an area with lead at high speed, obviously the psychological impact, and sometimes the physical one, of the MG42 is considerably greater. Same is just true of the BAR. This is something that isn't firing at that sort of rate, is not going to make people get their heads down quite so quickly and over quite such a wide area. James Holland and others have pointed out, well, the others are, the MG42's less reliable, wears out, you need to change the barrel, it is less accurate. I think this is one of the cases where he pushes the argument too far. Generally speaking, in most of the circumstances of 1944, 1945 infantry combat, the MG42 performed better. It does use up ammunition at a staggeringly quick rate, and far more than on the Allied side. The rest of a squad of German infantry become almost ammunition porters for the one, or in some cases two, MGs that were issued. And again, something that's noted in a lot of accounts, if the MGs got knocked out when the Germans were defending, then the rest of the platoon tended to give in. Not always, but that happens, I think, perhaps more as the campaign develops, and particularly with the sort of the infantry units and the poorer quality troops. Less so with the elites, but even there, it's this, both in attack and particularly in defense, is the main arm of the German infantry, and they're used with great skill. They're difficult to spot. The Germans did have an advantage that their powder caused less of a smoke trail, less of a flash than the Allied ordnance, so it was harder to spot the Germans when they were in a decently camouflaged position than it was the Allied equivalent. So that's a significant advantage for the Germans, though, not an overwhelming one, because obviously, again, we come back to the point the Allies do win, but it was capable of inflicting a lot of casualties very, very quickly, and also suppressing troops. Again and again, you get advances that bog down when they come under Spandau, as it's inevitably called, fire from the often from guns they couldn't locate. So in this respect, there's a technological edge, as it were, and that's been the way infantry support weapons have tended to develop since 1945, has been more rate of fire and spray rather than the impeccable accuracy of, say, a Bren gun. And bear in mind the BAR is a First World War weapon, modified, so it's running to catch up anyway. So there is, in terms of infantry weapons, more significant is the advantage that the Germans have with anti-tank weapons, the Panzerfaust and the Panzerschreck. They don't have many of these in the early days of Normandy, partly because production hasn't really got going, but also supply, and the Germans didn't know that the Allies were going to land in Normandy, so they haven't heavily tooled up the troops there with these weapons. That's something that, as the weeks pass, more and more are encountered, and it proves extremely effective. The British have the Piat, the Americans have the bazooka, neither of which are as easy. A Panzerfaust, it's cheap, it's throwaway, very short ranged, but you don't need much training to use it. You fire it once, you drop it, and you get another one. And it can penetrate any Allied armour. The rocket from the bazooka in use at the time couldn't penetrate frontal armour of a lot of German tanks. The Piat sometimes could, sometimes couldn't, but was obviously better, more sensibly fired and more safely fired towards a flank or rear of the target. It's a bit cumbersome, it's a bit heavy, it's spring-loaded, it has that Heath Robinson look, but it does actually work. Probably the more significant difference is the quantity of these weapons that were issued. So, you might be more likely to get one per platoon rather than more than one Panzerfaust in each section or squad of German infantry. So it was harder for Allied troops to take out German tanks if they didn't have an anti-tank gun support or armoured support than it was for German infantry to do the same. The Panzerfaust could knock out any of the Allied tanks consistently. The Churchill's frontal armour gave it a bit of a problem, but nevertheless, even then, you're probably in trouble. So although they're very short range, Normandy is a perfect place for very short range weapons, particularly in the hedgerow country, but also in the wheat fields, the barley fields, the cornfields of elsewhere, and again in built up areas. So that gives German troops an edge. Again, as I say, they are in short supply at the very beginning of the campaign, and even we would consider elite divisions like the SS Hitlerjugend, 12th SS Panzer Division, don't have many of these at first, but they do start to get them in quantity quite quickly, and that makes a big difference to, in quite a few cases, Allied armoured spearheads that penetrate are taken out by infantry with these weapons in a way that it was much harder. There are successes with the Piat, there are successes with the bazooka, but as I say, there just weren't as many of them. They weren't so readily available, so the chances of them being in the right place at the right time with sufficient ammunition and for the crew to survive long enough to deal with successive vehicles, it's much harder. In terms of anti-tank guns, again, not so much of a difference. I mean, the Germans have the Pak 40 as the standard. They've got various other ones as well. It's big, it's heavy, it's quite a thing for a crew to lug around. But it's very effective. It can again knock out any tank, any Allied tank at a long range. The American 3-inch did the job. The 57mm, that was a version of the British 6-pounder, less effective at this stage, hasn't yet got the armoured piercing discarding sabot ammunition, which the British are issuing, but only in the days leading up to D-Day itself and in the immediate aftermath. So that pushes the 6-pounder up from being an okay anti-tank weapon to a very effective one that in the right circumstances can take out any German tank. Although again, there was a learning curve with that because it was a higher velocity shot, so that when it was first used, many of the crews missed their target because they were giving too much lead to the vehicle they were aiming at. They thought that they had to, basically, you know, it's like deflection shooting, you've got to aim a bit for where it's going to be, not where it is. And in fact, it was so fast that they were shooting in front of it. So there were things like that, again, like the 17-pounder and the Firefly version, that people haven't got used to this. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun is a colossal thing and is very hard to push around, but once it's in position, can knock out any German tank. Anti-tank guns obviously give far more of an advantage when you're defending. They're difficult to use in the attack because getting them into position, they tend to be visible and vulnerable and can be taken out. In terms of, we'll come back to field artillery afterwards. In terms of tanks, talked about this more in the video about James's War and Hill 112, a little bit about the tank battles on film and all this sort of thing. The Panzer IV, which is the most numerous German tank in Normandy, is a bit better than the Sherman, the Cromwell, the Churchill. You know, the Churchill has heavier armour but is slower, more cumbersome. The Cromwell is faster, but it's 75mm gun or 6-pounder, depending on what it's armed with. Same with the Churchill, same with the Sherman. These can penetrate Panzer IV armour at reasonable range. The Panzer IV 75mm is a bit higher velocity, a bit better, perhaps a little bit less effective against infantry as high explosive, but more effective against tanks. So these are tanks that can readily be knocked out, particularly when they're spotted and in the open by the Allies, but also can knock out the Allies at probably a slightly longer range. So a bit of an advantage for the Germans, not quite as significant as when you go up a level to the Panther, which is the next most numerous tank rather than assault gun. This has much heavier armour, is impenetrable from the front, particularly on the hull, to the 75, the 6-pounder without discarding sabot rounds. I won't touch it either. Some people learned that, particularly with the earlier models, they could deflect around off the gun mantlet down onto the driver's compartment where the armour was thinner, so they could take it out from the front that way with the 75, but it was difficult. 17-pounder could penetrate, but you know, 1 in 4 Shermans is a 17-pounder, and the Americans aren't using the 76, which is less powerful but more effective anti-tank than the 75 until sometime into the Normandy campaign. You will hear a lot about the reliability of Allied tanks compared to German tanks. You know, the German tanks are over-engineered, gearboxes, engines aren't sufficiently strong for the weight involved, Panthers tend to break down, it has a slow turret traverse, all this sort of thing. Most of these are exaggerated and were less true this early on, in June 1944 and in the Battle for Normandy. By the end of the year, by the Ardennes, the Germans have cut the number of spare parts that are being manufactured for Panthers and other tanks so substantially that it makes maintenance a nightmare. The tanks themselves are that much older. Many of the units that arrived with Panthers in Normandy have new ones, and like the Hitlerjugend are able to drive there and don't suffer the breakdowns they're supposed to. So yes, there are disadvantages for this, but they are not so obvious at this stage. It's also a reflection of crew training and maintenance support crew training. Many of the best crewmen are lost in Normandy. By the time you get to the Ardennes, the drivers are unskilled, so they're not treating the gearbox with sufficient respect. The crews in general are less skilled because you've lost all the ones that you had time to train that gained the experience. So some of the things that are true, some of the valid criticisms you can level against tanks like the Panther later on in 1944 are significantly less true in Normandy. As I say, there's not the case of lots of breakdowns in the units driving to the battlefield or in the early stages. The side armour of a Panther, the rear armour, is considerably thinner and vulnerable, particularly as they have ammunition stowage close behind this. So you could hit them in the flank even with a 75, a 6-pounder, 57mm, whatever, you could knock them out. Again, that's something that's often easier to do when they're attacking you than when you're attacking them. When it's waiting for you, it's bigger, far higher velocity gun that can knock you out at far greater distances is extremely dangerous. So that comes back to something we talked about in the video on tank combat on film, and I think in the one on James's War and the Tank Commander's War in Normandy. Most tank-to-tank encounters occur when the winner is the person who sees the enemy first and gets the shot in first, aimed properly. And then it's much harder in the restricted vision of a tank to spot the enemy, discover the enemy, and then deal with them. You then, of course, have the Tiger. Both the Tiger 1 and some of the Tiger 2 later came in. So you have, this is much heavier, the 88mm, the high velocity 88 for the Tiger 2, far more powerful, very difficult to knock out, but it is heavy, it does have maintenance problems. They are not deployed in huge numbers in Normandy, and until very late all are deployed in the British-Canadian sector. None go over to the American sector, as far as we can tell, unless there's some oddities, the odd one with Panzerlehr or something like that. But the independent units that operate them, that are outside the divisional structure, that are core assets, are all deployed in the British-Canadian sector. The Tiger is extremely difficult to knock out, extremely powerful. If you encounter them, life is going to be hard. They can be knocked out, particularly from the side, particularly by 17-pounders, but it's, you need to be in the right position to do it. So they are, again, more vulnerable when they attack than when they're defending. When they're in ambush positions and can simply snipe at you at long range, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be hard to take them out. You also have, again, something where there's no Allied equivalent, the Stug 3s and 4s and the various Jagdpanzers, the Jagdpanther as well in small numbers, also the self-propelled guns like the Marder 3 and others that operate. The Germans have these hunting tanks that are cheaper to produce. You can put a bigger gun and thicker armour on a smaller chassis, so they're reusing the Panzer 3 chassis or the production lines for that to produce the Stug. These are dotted around. Some of them are serving instead of tanks in panzer divisions. They're in Panzer Grenadier division like the 17th SS. They only have Stugs, they don't have turreted tanks. They have Jagdpanzers in some of the Panzerjäger units in all sorts of divisions. They're in infantry divisions, will often or should have a Stug and assault gun component. So these are dotted around, sometimes in the big, heavily armoured, mechanised Panzer divisions, Panzer Grenadier divisions, sometimes in infantry divisions as well, and in some supporting units that are put in. They're simpler to produce, they are easier to manufacture, they are limited in that having no turret and no ability to, only very limited, you've got to manoeuvre the whole vehicle to aim at the target rather than just turning the turret. That's a restriction, but it's again a restriction that is more noticeable in the attack rather than when you're defending. From ambush, they can be extremely effective, and because they're small and low profile, they are easier to conceal. So they do very well. The Stug crews, it's changing by this stage of the war, but up until then, because they've been artillery trained, seem to have a higher level of gunnery in certain circumstances than you get in some of the Panzer divisions. Again, I'm sure they would argue about that, but that does seem to be a pattern. The self-propelled guns, the various versions of Marder, they're usually with a Pak-40 mounted on a Panzer 38T chassis or something like that. Very vulnerable in terms of being open-topped and little armour, but again, as an ambush weapon, extremely effective because it's a very powerful gun, but it is a shoot and scoot thing, really. You don't want to stay around for reprisals because you don't have and you certainly don't use them on our Saving Private Ryan for close assault into a built-up area with infantry. This is a very bad idea. So you have these things. The Allies don't really have an equivalent of these things. By this stage in the war, although the Stug had originally been designed as basically an armoured version of the infantry gun, so to assault with troops in close support, It can do that, but it is probably less and less suited to that now, and it's become more of a defensive ambush weapon, but it's very, very effective at that. So there are significant advantages to the firepower, the armour protection of the German equipment in Normandy, particularly on the defence, at least in many respects. The Germans are obviously using Stugs and Marders and Jagdpanzers and things like that because it's easier to produce them, quicker to produce them than it is to produce conventional tanks. And they're still using lots of Panzer IVs because German industry has not been able to gear up to replace all the Panzer IVs with Panthers. The Allied industry is producing very large numbers, particularly of Shermans, but of all the tanks they need. And again, bear in mind, those Shermans are manufactured in America. They're then shipped across the Atlantic, usually to England first, and then they're shipped to Normandy. And as are all the spare parts, all the replacement engines, all the ammunition, all this sort of thing. You could do that with a 30-ton Sherman. If you tried doing it with a 45-ton Panther equivalent, all of that would have been much harder. You wouldn't have had so many, and they'd be much, much harder to transport over those sorts of distances. So the Sherman makes Normandy strategically possible. But it does have some disadvantages. But again, it was designed with the idea that a tank was there to support infantry in the attack, and that mostly it would be engaging anti-tank guns and enemy infantry and providing a firepower that your own infantry lacked. It wasn't there to fight tanks. US Army doctrine has had to change. The original idea was that tank destroyers, specifically towed and self-propelled guns, would take out the enemy armor when they needed to. That proves not to be the case. It doesn't always work, and it causes all sorts of problems. But again, the Sherman is very, very good, and the high effectiveness of the high explosive 75mm round is makes it an extremely good infantry support tank. So you can get it there, and it can also, it should be noted that that infantry support role remains the commonest form of tank deployment throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe. That's actually what you do the most of. So in a sense, the pre-war doctrine was right, but there are exceptions. And when you do come up against enemy tanks or enemy self-propelled guns, it can be very, very difficult for you. It can be very costly in terms of vehicles being destroyed. And that's the case in Normandy. It's particularly the case on the British-Canadian sector in the east, where the bulk of the German armour is deployed. So you have large-scale tank battles fought there in a way you don't get anywhere else, or very rarely anyway, in Northwest Europe. I suppose the late 44, the deployment of the Panzer brigades against the Third Army mostly, Aracore and things like that. You do get quite large tank battles. You get some in the Ardennes, though less than you might think. You don't get too many in the western side of the Normandy campaign because the terrain there simply doesn't favour large-scale armoured operations, big tank battles. You tend to get troop against troop, individual tank against individual tank, very occasionally squadron against troop or squadron against squadron, but you don't get regiment against regiment, which you sometimes do get in the British-Canadian sector, particularly early on, but right the way through. So things are peculiar there, and Shermans and Cromwells and Churchills are being called upon to fight German panzers, self-propelled guns, much more at times in Normandy, and particularly in that sector, than they will elsewhere. So that brings out some of their weaknesses more than it might have done at other points. And finally, let's come on to artillery and mortars, this sort of thing. The Germans have a lot of mortars. They use them very effectively. They are extremely effective in Normandy and do much of the killing from the German point of view, inflict more casualties than almost anything else. They use lots of mortars partly because they can't afford lots of artillery, and partly because they're easier to conceal. You have the Nebelwerfer, the rocket mortars, the smoke discharges they're supposed to be, or at least the cover name for them, that are longer ranged, bigger rounds, not accurate but good for blanketing an area with firepower, but then moving out quickly because your position is easy to locate and you're going to attack counter-battery fire. On the whole, if you look at Allied artillery, whether it's the 25-pounder, the 105 American, or the 155s, the 4.5s, 5.5s the British are using, is at least as good, if not better, than the German equivalent in terms of its technology. The Germans have 100mm, 105s, 155s, various guns, including quite a lot of captured stuff as well they're using. And it's good. A lot of it's quite old in design. Some of the Allied stuff is newer. The Allies have more self-propelled artillery, though the Germans do have some of that as well. And they land a lot of that in the Gold Juno sector to make sure they can get artillery ashore quickly and into position to meet the German counterattacks. There is no significant German advantage in the quality of any of their field pieces. Yes, the Allies don't have an equivalent to the Nebelwerfer, but is it really that important? It clearly has a psychological impact on Allied troops that come under fire from it that is deeply disturbing, traumatic, and can cause combat stress breakdown, that sort of thing, but I'm not sure it actually wins any situation for them. The Allies have at least equality and in some respects advantages when it comes to field, medium, let alone heavy artillery. And of course they've got the naval gunfire for at least most of the first half of the Normandy campaign, which is a big advantage the Germans can't match. The big thing comes in, well, first quantity of Allied artillery that's available, and then the ammunition that is available for it to use can't be matched by the Germans. That isn't necessarily true right from the start, but as more and more comes ashore, then it does become true. The big advantage they have with that is actually something where the fire control systems, the organization of divisional artillery, corps artillery, army artillery, the ability to concentrate immense firepower on a very small area and bring it under the control of a forward observation officer by the Allies is something the Germans can't match, and it is something that time and time again Eastern Front veterans talk about never having experienced anything like this, and it is the big killer of German troops in Normandy, will be the Allied artillery. If anything, you could argue there's maybe the British and Canadians, the Canadians in particular, have been more innovative in developing this and how to use it. There are more gunners than there are artillerymen sent by the British and Canadians normally. It's getting to about 41% of all the troops that are sent there are artillery or artillery related. And I don't just say this because I was in the RA troop when I was in the OTC as a student, as these pictures showing a much younger and more svelte Goldsworthy will show. A vain one as well, because he's taken off his glasses for the photograph. That firepower mattered, the ability to bring it in. The doctrine was then, and continued to be, gave more initiative to the forward observation officer. So I think the British and Canadians will probably have a slight advantage, at least at the start, that the US Army does what it tends to do throughout the war, and if it makes a mistake early on, it learns faster than the British seem to be able to do, and improves quicker. I think there was probably more bringing in more at the right point quickly, and also British and Canadian planning tended to revolve very much around the use of artillery for an offensive. Now that did mean that some of their offensives were more, plodding is perhaps too severe, but a bit more controlled, a bit more careful, a bit slower than some of the American advances, particularly after the breakthrough, would prove to be. So again, all of these things, you can have an advantage, but there's usually a counter element where you're not quite so good at something else. But in terms of artillery, the Allies are certainly not at a disadvantage and are probably superior. And some of that is technology, some of it is the industrial capacity, but there is also an element that they have grown, they have developed a way of using this that is probably more sophisticated. And they've also become highly sophisticated in terms of range finding, sound location, the ability to locate German artillery and then to suppress it. So those are differences, and some of them are to do with the experience of the army, the background of the country, the way things have developed long before you get to Normandy. Others are factors that prove particularly significant there. So when it comes to how you actually use all this equipment, again, what you have is a pattern of Allied offensives, particularly in June and into July, that have disappointing results. And these can be Operation Epsom, Operation Goodwood, in the British Canadian sector, some of the early attempts. It takes the Americans longer than expected to capture Cherbourg, longer than expected to capture Saint-Lô, which helps them to control the road network. Takes the British and Canadians much longer to take Caen. Bayeux falls into, but then everything is slow. Progress is much slower than Montgomery had forecast and promised. And it doesn't help that he and other Allied commanders make grand claims about how they're going to have a breakthrough, and then when it doesn't happen, when 7th Armoured Division are doing a right hook around, they bump into some elements of heavy SS Panzer and Panzer coming up at Villers-Bocage. Fight a brutal action. You have the initial ambush of the County of London Yeomanry, heavy losses to tanks there by Wittmann and his Tigers that come in, but also heavy fighting with Panzer. That offensive doesn't happen. The Germans stabilise the line, and the Allies are left plodding their way forward, plugging their way forward, getting to a sort of First World War situation where you are taking ground by half miles and miles rather than by tens of miles or breakthroughs like that. And it's slow and it's extremely costly in lives, and you're pouring large amounts of firepower onto it, and you're also calling upon the strategic bombing force to try and bomb your way through the German positions. Spectacularly at Goodwood, where yes, it does cause a lot of damage, but the assault still fails with huge losses in tanks and to some extent crews, but particularly in tanks, even though you've packed 3 armoured divisions into a small area and tried to send them rocketing forward. It doesn't work out. That's partly because they are deployed too close together and they can't get through the minefields, and they can't. But there are other reasons for that. There is a sense that major Allied offensives are at the very least disappointing and often close to being outright failures. So that at the time leads to a lot of recrimination. It doesn't help that Montgomery always promises publicly far more than is delivered now, and then claims subsequently that, well, he didn't expect it to be delivered anyway, and it was just for keeping people's spirits up and encouraging the press and all this sort of thing. It's very hard to tell what the truth is, whether he really expected more to happen or not. Again, bear in mind that in Sicily and in Italy, the Germans had not tried to hold a line as solidly and as long as they did in Normandy. So this leads to Hastings and others arguing that, well, simply, the Allied armies are not as good as their German opponents, and even when they have significant numerical advantages, they can't break through. They have to wear the Germans down gradually, and it's only then that they're able to break through, and that this shows the superiority of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, that they were tactically better, they had better equipment, and they used it more effectively. And that the huge loss of Shermans, Cromwells, and the like in the fighting in these areas. We do have to be a little bit careful about accepting all of this at face value. In the first place, yes, clearly the Allied High Command expected things to go better, faster than actually happened. And yes, although when first committed, many units were willing to go forward and push on and took high casualties, but then in many cases still failed to achieve at least all the objectives. They only got some of them. As you're losing all your best and boldest leaders, the survivors tend to be more cautious. They're less willing to do this the next time and the next time and so on. And you have situations where unit commanders are essentially deciding that things aren't going to work, so let's not push as far as this, let's not risk losing too many men. You have some breakdowns, you have increasingly high rates of combat fatigue, you have, there's a famous report written by the battalion commander of a battalion of the Duke of Wellington's regiment that recommends disbanding the unit if they can't take it out of the line and reform and retrain it, because it's just suffered too many casualties and the spirit has gone. He's had to stand at the end of lane with a pistol to stop people running away more than once. He's just losing too many of his leaders and can't replace them. Hastings quotes that at length, slightly out of context, and Again, that was exceptional. That battalion is broken up and that does fail, but it had had a particularly bad run of luck. And it's, again, you have to think, well, it didn't happen to other units that did have bad luck, that did take high casualties. They seemed to cope. So yes, for all the cases of combat fatigue, it was very, very high. Nevertheless, a lot more men actually did cope and did stay there. But there are two big things to be set against this sense of, well, the offensives are disappointing at best, and that therefore that means that the troops tactically and in terms of equipment are not up to things. The contrast made by Max Hastings and others is with the commandos, the rangers, the airborne divisions that are dropped, where even when scattered and with far fewer men than they should have had, again and again, small groups got together, aggressively attacked and took the objectives that they were supposed to do. And that those units all remained in the line much longer than they were supposed to and had to serve as ordinary infantry. Think back to Band of Brothers and the attack on, oh gosh, it's not, I think of Carenton, sorry. I think of Carpiquet, which is the airfield outside Caen. The Canadians have a vicious battle for. The 6th Airborne Division, the British, stay in the line much longer than planned. And these infantry, like the commandos, like the rangers, are used for aggressive tasks, but they don't have the manpower and they can't take the casualties for too long. And these elite troops are harder to replace. That brings in the whole debate of, when you create elite units like that, do they justify it because their performance tends to be exceptionally good, and certainly the case with those airborne divisions, both in Normandy and elsewhere, but have you taken the cream off your recruits so that your best aggressive junior leaders and many of your best aggressive soldiers have moved on? They're not in the standard sort of line regiments of infantry, and therefore the edge on those is blunter than it might be. It's always it's an impossible one to answer, because you can only look at what actually occurs. There's probably some truth in it, but then there may also be a truth that those men perform all the better because they're surrounded by others who are volunteers, who have gone through that more extensive, more arduous training, and have that sense of being special, then go to fulfill that. But anyway, coming on to these offensives that don't really succeed, one thing that's worth noting is that by 1944, indeed really by 1943, anybody in the Second World War who attacks a well-prepared, reasonably strong, motivated enemy doesn't have the spectacular breakthroughs that you'd had in 1940, 1941, and even to some extent in 42. The world has changed. Defenders don't give in so easily when they see tanks. Infantry start to have better anti-tank capability. You're not so daunted by air power as you had been before. What was possible in the years of Blitzkrieg just isn't possible for anybody at this point. So some of the expectations for these offensives are unrealistic, both at the time and with hindsight. The other point to make about this, yes, again and again, the British or the Americans, British in particular, attack and have an initial breakthrough, try and exploit it. The Germans rush in, often outnumbered forces, but they manage to get people into place that block those Allied spearheads, and then before the Allies can recover from that and renew the offensive, they seem to be slow moving, a bit cumbersome. The Germans have put enough troops into the line that they hit a far more solid obstacle and they simply can't break through. So the possibilities of the early days for a battle of manoeuvre to break through, to outflank the enemy and get through. Remember again, all the big successes of the Blitzkrieg years were achieved by the doctrine of bypassing the enemy's strong points. Breaking through, getting behind them, surrounding them, isolating them, and leaving them to be dealt with by Luftwaffe, by infantry divisions who could then destroy those pockets. And it's what the Russians are able to do in Operation Bagration. To some extent, they're able to isolate large parts of the Germans, but that's on a much, much bigger front, where the Germans don't have the reserves that they would have liked to have because they've had to go off to fight in Italy and particularly in Normandy. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps being a prime case, they've actually been moved from the Russian front to Normandy to be committed by late June. So the whole idea, the secret success of those early things was not butting head on against the enemy's strength, but bypassing the enemy's strength, using your mobility, using your speed, losing your firepower to take out the weaker sections and pushing on, surrounding them, or relying on them to collapse, which they sometimes do. But by 1944, they don't necessarily collapse and surrender. And everybody's learnt that game. So it's a little bit like Napoleon's later battles from 1812, 1813 onwards. It's not just that his own army is perhaps not quite the army it had been in 1805, 1807, because you've got so many of those soldiers killed, and then you've expanded and you've diluted the quality. But your opponents have learned. They are not fooled quite so easily by the aggression of your attack, your maneuver, your ability to rush and concentrate on the battlefield. You know, it's just harder. It was easier to do this early in the war when the Germans had planned for this and then found that it worked and then gained the great confidence that it worked, and in return their opponents were already half beaten before they started, you know, as Wellington said of the French opponents before he went out to the Peninsular War, that he thought, you know, there was an element, it was a psychological thing, they were expecting to lose and therefore more easily quit. That's just not the case by 1944. So it is unrealistic. Later on, after the breakout, the Allies can rush around, they can do this move, they can take ground very quickly. The Russians can do this in Bagration on a much wider front with big advantage in numbers, mobility, and once they break through, they can do the blitzkrieg stuff. But you can't do this against a well-prepared defense. The Russians had shown this when the Germans attacked them at Kursk. You know, banging your head against lines of prepared defensives and a stubborn defender who isn't going to quit doesn't work. In that case, they're still learning the cost in lives is immense and disproportionately you know, against the Russians. They suffer heavier losses than the Germans, even though they win. It's getting harder. So things have changed. The second point to mention is that Normandy is not an ideal area for launching offensives and for mobile warfare and armoured warfare. The reason the Allies chose Normandy had nothing to do with the land inland from the beaches. You know, it's not a good place to land from the point of view of exploiting the landing. It's a great place to land because it's within range of the Spitfire, it's less well defended and less obvious than the Pas de Calais, and there's enough beaches that are suitable for landing on between ports. You don't have to attack a fortified port. It's chosen for other reasons. It's not chosen because it's thought that once we're ashore we'll be able to exploit things quickly. The worst of the terrain is in the American sector, the densest of the bocage, that makes mobile warfare, armoured warfare, incredibly difficult. And, you know, it is a big step forward when the Americans developed the Cullen device for, you know, you mount on the bow of tanks so you can cut through the hedges or burst through them really, rather than climbing over them, exposing the soft under armour of the tank to a Panzerfaust, to a light anti-tank gun, to whatever it is who can knock you out with ease. Before that, you were largely restricted to the roads. Once you're able to do that, that doesn't happen till Cobra, really, in late July. And even then, it's difficult, and it's helped by the fact that the Germans have been worn down and that most of the armour is in the British-Canadian sector, as was the plan. You have areas of bocage in the British and Canadian sector that cause all the same problems for the attacker. It should be noted they create problems for the defender as well, in that some of the Germans' advantages in terms of the long range of many of their weapons are less of an asset in areas of bocage. Even more restrictive, it's harder for artillery observers to have such a good position, such a good vantage point from which they can call in artillery to meet an Allied offensive, an Allied attack. So that's why there's such heavy fighting for Hill 112 and other high points where there are these vantage points. The Germans make great use of their mortars, which tend to be called in by observers who are much closer to the target and much closer to the mortars themselves. Their artillery, it's harder for it to be used to concentrate on Allied spearheads, Allied attacking troops, and break them up, pin them down. When you're attacking, you've already decided much of your fire plan before the offensive begins, and you know when you're going to be putting in a barrage here, there and everywhere, and you've tried to identify the enemy positions to suppress. And you can still react quicker because you've got a better radio network. Again, that's an advantage that and field telephone lines and all this sort of thing. You know, the Allies are up with that. So to some extent, Bocage country is great for using a Panzerfaust, it's great for an ambushing with a Stug and all this sort of thing, but it's harder to make, use of the 88 mils range, the Tiger, the Panther, whatever it might be, and it's harder to use your artillery. Now, not all of the land in the east of Normandy is bocage. There is some areas of open country that does play into the advantages of the Germans in terms of the superior range of many of their tanks and guns. So that gives advantages to the defender they lack in the bocage, whilst denying them others. Obviously, it's much harder to conceal your position. You're more vulnerable to Allied long-range weapons and Allied artillery in particular. But generally speaking, Normandy favours the defender, and on balance, you would feel that the type of warfare by 1944, the technology favours the defender more than the attacker when they are well prepared, well equipped and motivated. So we shouldn't be altogether surprised that the Allied offensives fail or are disappointing and, gradually they hack their way forward. However, the counter-argument is rarely put, or it's just excused by the strategic situation. But if the Germans were going to have any chance of winning in Normandy, they had to drive the Allies back to the beaches and off the beaches. They had to defeat that. The longer the Allies held those positions, the more troops, the more material could arrive, and all the numbers would go in their favour steadily. So as Rommel understood, you needed to try and beat them on the beaches or very soon afterwards by a counterattack, hence his desire to have the panzer divisions closer to the beaches so they could intervene on the day of the landing itself or very soon afterwards. Now, all sorts of delays, Hitler refusing to give the order to release the armoured reserves, Allied air power, strafing them as they came in, means that the German armour does not get quickly into place. However, it should also be noted that in contrast to, say, Salerno or some of the landings in Sicily, you don't get German offensives anywhere in Normandy that actually threaten the beaches themselves. They are all stopped inland. When they develop, they're never delivered with quite the weight of numbers, the strength of units. 21st Panzer puts in its attacks alone with separate Kampfgruppen. 12th SS Panzer arrives, and over the 7th, 8th, 9th, that period again puts in fairly disjointed attacks, often not coordinated with 21st Panzer, or when it starts to arrive, Panzerlehr, 2nd Panzer Division, and other units. The big truth of Normandy is that none of the German offensives succeed. And even their local counterattacks, yes, they sometimes make some limited ground or take back ground that the Allies have taken, but they never push them back to where they've started, other than in very local fighting. And they never get near organising the massed assault, which was the only way they were going to win this campaign. Otherwise, it was all going to be downhill. It might take a long time, but they were going to be worn down. So that reminds you that it's, yes, you can say, as the Germans were inclined to say, well, there was overwhelming Allied air power, there was overwhelming artillery, naval gunfire, all these sorts of things. The air power question is less true of the early days and week or so in Normandy, because remember, the weather was very, very bad. And also the coordination between the ground troops and the fighter bombers was less good than it would become later on. And you can say there are strategic failings, that the Germans don't coordinate, they don't gather their panzer divisions together and launch corps level attacks very effectively. When the 1st SS Panzer arrives, it's fed in piecemeal. When the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions arrive, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps that is supposed to deliver, it's basically their last chance, late in June, early July, of a major offensive. It's there again fed in piecemeal. What attacks do occur do not make very much progress. They might go forward a bit, but they're stopped, and they are stopped in their tracks. And at each stage, which comes back to this point that it is very hard to attack in 1944, it's particularly hard to attack in the conditions of Normandy. And saying that, oh, well, it's naval gunfire, it's air power, all this sort of thing, is rather like saying, well, the British, Canadian and American offensives are failing because the Germans have the MG42 and they have Panther tanks and Tiger tanks and 88mm guns and all this sort of thing. Yes, those things give advantages, but the whole point is that nobody is finding it easy to attack by 1944 and in Normandy. and that the Germans fail again and again, and they partly fail to coordinate, but there's even elements where the attacks when divisions arrive. 12th SS Panzer flings itself, local commanders, regimental group commanders, camp group commanders pretty much fling their stuff at the enemy as soon as possible. And it's a very German thing. Yes, you have the sort of, the rational Clausewitzian staff work approach to warfare, but you also have the Feldmarschall Blucher sort of, let's throw everything at them as quickly as we can. Let's just be aggressive. The Rommel type way of doing things, and lots of other German, it was part of the German military tradition. This emphasis being more violent quickly than the enemy would be enough to overcome the longer term disadvantage you had in overall numbers. Being more skillful. This is combat that ought to play to those supposed greater tactical skills, better equipment, better leadership that the Germans and Canadians, the Germans possess compared to the British Canadians and the Americans. And yet there are local successes, but they're all limited. The beaches themselves are never under serious threat. There is never any prospect of the Germans driving the Allies into the sea. And the Allies have prepared very well to make sure that doesn't happen. But when the Germans attack, they are poorly coordinated, clumsy, not properly supported. Their armoured units, even with Panthers and later on with Tigers, suffer heavy losses when they come out into the open, and the Allied anti-tank guns or concealed tanks, even infantry weapons, are able to hit them in the side, hit them in the flank. There are heavy losses of equipment, and again, the Germans cannot replace this, whereas the Allies can. So you will see these divisions arriving and being flung into immediate local counterattacks or plugging the gaps to stop a British or an American or Canadian offensive in its tracks, which they succeed in doing. They stabilise the line again and again as each unit comes up, but they make no significant forward progress. And in terms of the strategic position, this is dooming the German war effort. They cannot win if this keeps happening, because they need to drive the Allies back into the sea, and they never come close to doing that. And some of this it is difficult to attack in these circumstances and in Normandy. Sorry, a voice is going, so I needed to have a bit of a drink. And that's also one of the sort of underlying truths of Normandy. The British, the Americans land some experienced divisions that do or do not perform so well, at least initially. They land some new divisions, that some of which perform very well, some less so. 43rd Wessex, 15th Scottish do particularly well. Some of the other divisions seem a bit more disappointing. The same in the American sector, some units just do better than others. And that comes back to all this, this mixed quality, the human nature, that some people, you'll have the right people in the right places or the wrong people in the wrong places, that can make a huge difference to performance, plus luck. I can't remember which one it is. One of the American divisions gets bombed by friendly forces more often than everyone else. When you have that sort of bad luck, it's very hard to motivate your people. But if you also notice, again, it comes back to this point, Normandy is not where you would have chosen to fight a battle of exploitation. If you just look at a map of the road system, nothing really goes in the direction the Allies want it to go. You've got much better east-west communication or diagonal communication. There's very little going north-south. It's always quite hard to go in the direction that most of the Allied offensives want to go in. And conversely for the Germans trying to drive for the beach, this applies to both sides. And that gives you problems in that most of your transport is road-bound, is based in trucks, and you're putting this into a Normandy road system that is not designed for this, where you're grinding up the roads very quickly because you're putting tanks and lots of heavy vehicles along it in ways it's not qualified, not designed for. You have, when you start bombarding villages, you bring down rubble that blocks up the drains, so you end up with flooding in a lot of these villages, which again slows down the transport, the supplies that go there. But one of the big picture factors that does have an influence on performance, man for man and unit for unit in Normandy, is that although initially the Germans have a mixture of some fairly second-rate coastal defensive divisions and the odd good infantry, Luftwaffe unit, Fallschirmjäger, this sort of thing in the American sector, but a lot of low-quality troops, the ones that arrive in that critical first month or so after D-Day tend to be very high quality. And the reason for this is partly that the Allies have bombed the blazes out of the rail system and the transport network within France. Most of the German troops that get to Normandy in the early days get there by walking or driving. It's obviously easier for the more mechanized divisions to get there. So, you get 12th SS Panzer, Panzerlehr, 2nd Panzer Division, then the 2nd SS Panzer Division will make its way to the American sector in that rather violent progress through France, faced by the Marquis, and with those vicious reprisals. 1st SS Panzer Division, Liebstandarte, will arrive later in June. 9th and 10th SS Panzer, 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division has arrived in the American sector fairly early on. Some of those troops, even in that supposedly elite SS Panzer Grenadier Division, have cycled there. But most are able to drive. And although they suffer losses from Allied fighter bombers and the like en route, that tends to fall on the soft-skinned vehicles far more than the armoured ones. Panzerlehr, all its Panzer Grenadier divisions are in armoured 251 APCs, armoured half-tracks. All this glitzy kit gets there. The best units arrive quickly, and then they are thrown not into the counter-offensive role on a large scale, which is what they're designed to do and what the whole point of this, the German strategy should be. Instead, they are used as a fire brigade to plug the gap and break the Allied offensive. And one of the things that Montgomery does achieve, and the Allies achieve generally both in the British, Canadian and American sectors, is these early offensives. While they don't achieve very much, they draw in the German reinforcements. And particularly the eastern sector, where the British and Canadians are, is the easiest area for the German reserves to reach. It's where the transport network takes them. It's also got the most open country. It is the most favourable prospect for an offensive to drive the Allies back to the sea. So the panzer divisions and most of the armour ends up concentrated on a very narrow frontage in the British and Canadian sector. So you have far more tank-to-tank combat here and far more tanks per mile of front than you have, say, in Russia, but also than you have in the American sector. It's not good tank countries. The Germans don't deploy so much over there. The nature of the fighting is that most of the troops the Allies tend to encounter, particularly the British and Canadians, from in the early days of the fighting through most of June and into July, are not run-of-the-mill infantry divisions, let alone by this time the second-rate sort of coastal divisions and the like. They are the pick of the bunch. They are the mechanized units. They are, and you have, Fallschirmjäger and others fighting the Americans. But the bulk of the panzer divisions, and it's also, it is interesting, and it's a reflection of the expansion of the Waffen-SS by this time, but you have a very high proportion, more Waffen-SS panzer units, panzer grenadier units, than you would, them as a reflection of the overall German army at this time, are sent there to Normandy. Now, again, just because they're Waffen-SS doesn't necessarily mean that they're good, that they've got the best equipment. They tended to be favoured for equipment, but Panzerlehr and 2nd Wehrmacht Panzer Division are elites in their own right and probably have as good, if not better, equipment than some of the SS units. The German practice throughout the war was to send a unit, commit it to fighting, usually, obviously, for years, in recent years in Russia, wait for it to be ground down, rather than reinforce it while it was at the front, wait for it to be reduced to what they call a torso division, where essentially nearly all your infantry had become casualties, and as had a lot of your armour crew, but that your artillery, your support arms, your logistics were pretty much intact. You'd then withdraw it and you'd send replacements in and you'd reform the division as a division. And it was part of this idea that it should fight as a division, something the Allies didn't really develop to anything like the same extent. But then in Normandy that breaks down. You send these units to plug gaps in the line to block an Allied threatened breakthrough, and then they stay there. And the tanks can become mobile pillboxes. But that's not really what they're for. And it's not what these divisions are designed to do. And your Panzer Grenadiers end up holding stretches of the line. And it's much later on the whole that infantry divisions finally get to Normandy, because it's taken time for them to travel there, because it's been a while before you've released troops from the Pas-de-Calais, that they will actually go and be able to replace and do what they should be doing, holding sectors of the line so that you can pull back your armoured units and they can form mobile reserves to be used for counterattacks to meet any enemy offensives, but ideally and in theory for the big attack, big offensive of your own that's going to drive the Allies back to the sea. The Germans are never given the opportunity to do that. They never form enough of a concentrated striking force with the combat power to fight its way through the Allies and pose any serious chance of throwing them back into the sea and winning the battle for Normandy. Instead, British, American, Canadian, in effect sort of line divisions, average infantry divisions, end up, with the armoured divisions as well, but they end up launching offensives against positions held by the pick of the bunch for the Germans, by Panzer Grenadiers, who have a higher allocation of weaponry, support weapons, mortars, machine guns, plus the armour support, and at least in theory should be better coordinated in the combined arms operations because they're all part of the same divisions. Again, it's not always true. You find plenty of cases where panzer units will attack on their own, the Panzer Grenadiers will be attacking from a different direction. And that can sometimes work because it's a quick response, but it can also lead to the loss of heavy losses on both sides, whether you're losing vehicles that you can't replace or whether your infantry are being chewed up by particularly by the Allied artillery. And again, the German doctrine of an immediate counterattack. You know, you hold your front positions with relatively small forces, wait for the Allied offensive to come in, and then when the Allies are trying to consolidate, reorg, this sort of thing, and particularly the British and Canadians doing it in their fairly methodical way, you then hit them with a counterattack, hopefully driving them back to where they've started, or at least back. That's great, and it often works to a fair extent, but it also brings your men out into the open and into the teeth, really, of the Allied artillery with its very good observers that then start to pummel you. And the losses you suffer, again, of troops and material that you will find great difficulty replacing. So there is a mistake, and you can look at you'll see it in Hastings' book and others, there's a famous list based on Allied intelligence estimates of the size of German armoured divisions when they escape from the Falaise pocket. And it's, you know, a couple of hundred infantry, a few tanks, no tanks, this sort of thing. This is often presented as those entire divisions. It's not, it's the teeth arms. You know, the Panzer Grenadier units have been ground down almost to nothing. The tank units may have been ground down almost to nothing, but probably the artillery, the logistics, the staff, all of that is almost intact, which is one of the reasons why later in 1944 the German units start to reappear far quicker than the Allies thought was possible, because the organisation has still been there, and you bring in more recruits and you give them more equipment. They're less good than they had been, but you can replace these divisions. Now, the elite divisions that arrive in Normandy are in various stages of recovering from a mauling on the Eastern Front in almost every case. 12th SS Panzer is a new formation, so that's a little bit different, but most of the others have been sent to France, to the West, to recover. 9th and 10th had been held back to do that. They've been sent to Russia earlier, then they brought back to the West as part of the reserve. But these are, again, the best rated German divisions, even if they're not all as efficient as they're supposed to be, as they ideally should be, as strong as they ideally should be. Hitlerjugend, for instance, is below strength in terms of NCOs and junior leaders when it goes to Normandy, which is a big deal. Some of the other units the same. And just how well prepared. So on the one hand, the Allies find themselves fighting elite German units very quickly, and it's perhaps not surprising that this is difficult and very costly in lives and that the Germans perform well. On the other hand, some of these German units were less prepared than was ideal by German standards, and they're all thrown in rather too quickly, and they're not always as well led. The big expansion of the Waffen-SS had exposed the problem that you didn't have enough experienced Waffen-SS staff officers available to run things. So the Wehrmacht was often quite scornful of their staff work, their ability to coordinate with units on their flank, this sort of. So particularly the British and Canadians, but to some extent in some sectors the Americans as well, meet a lot of very good German troops disproportionately so. They're not facing the average unit. When the infantry units arrive, it is striking how quickly they are pretty much devoured by the Allied military system in Normandy. They suffer very heavy losses to artillery, and also they give up a lot of prisoners. The Allies take a lot of prisoners in a way that doesn't happen on the Eastern Front. People are reluctant to surrender to the Red Army. But they do surrender to the British Canadians and the Americans in much greater numbers. And most of the infantry divisions that arrive in Normandy are used up within a week or at most 2 weeks, and are reduced to very small battle groups beyond that. The panzer divisions have lasted much longer because they were far stronger in the first place in terms of firepower and quality, leadership, all this sort of thing, mobility. So there's, in a sense, you're not quite comparing like with like, and whereas Hastings and others will argue that even the ordinary units do very well and stop Allied offensives, perhaps they do, but then comparatively ordinary Allied units will stop the offensives by the pick of the German army. The Germans achieve a lot, and you can say that at times they do show greater tactical sophistication. It's very hard to know with numbers like this. The argument is made that they tend to inflict more casualties than they suffer. And there is some evidence that can be seen that way, although you have to be careful that each situation is going to be unique, and that the German records are not always as reliable as the Allied records, so we have to be a little bit careful that we do know just what's going on. But again, that comes back to the weaponry, the firepower, the MG42, these advantages that the Germans do possess in the circumstances of Normandy that will become less of an advantage as the quality of the German army deteriorates even more after Normandy. This is the last gasp, certainly in the West, of the Wehrmacht at its peak, but it's still past its peak even by this time. But the nature of the strategic situation means the British and Canadians fight a lot of very well equipped and motivated German units, and that therefore these battles are particularly costly. These offensives do fail, and there is more aggression. You have the ideology. These are recruits that not only are they'll be threatened, and they'll be, if they don't perform well, and they'll be punished, but they have had an upbringing. You've got a Hitler Youth division of people who've been raised with this ideology that you are part of a martial race, you are the great soldiers, you are superior to the enemy. In the early days, the Hitlerjugend suffer quite a few a lot of the men surrender and prisoners, and they're sort of these shocked teenagers. But on the other hand, a lot of them then the bulk perform extremely well and fight with great determination, not always with skill. You have the case where they attempt night attacks led by armour on the Canadian positions, something that was a common tactic in the Ukraine, in Russia, and worked because there's much more space. The communications available to the Soviet army are far more limited. They can't react as quickly as the Western allies. So, but the Canadians stop them dead, and at great cost. It's a tough fight, but it doesn't work. They don't panic. They don't break down. And there's a comment by a Canadian officer afterwards that they thought we were blank Russians. It's clearly dismissive. There are other things the Red Army might have done better than the Western allies, but tactics learnt in Russia didn't always work in Normandy. Tactics learned by the British in the desert didn't always work in Normandy. Tactics learned in Italy by the British, Canadians and Americans didn't always work in Normandy. You had to learn how to fight in those circumstances against that opponent. And in the eastern sector, you are fighting against a stronger than usual German army where lots of armour and mechanised assets and high quality Panzer Grenadiers are concentrated on a very narrow frontage. As these divisions arrived, it is very densely defended, which means that you are banging your head against very strong things. The Americans have the problem that they're dealing with the worst of the country, and in some cases with some elite units, but even the country is so difficult that some of the more mediocre ones can be very formidable in that, until again they work out, how do you fight in these circumstances? How do you attack in these circumstances? That takes time. And the danger with all of this, while you're learning and putting in these costly attacks, many of your best leaders are getting killed or wounded and are therefore not in a position to pass on what they've learned and adapt to it. So I would say, coming back to the initial question of which is the most effective army in Normandy, is that at the simplest level, well, you've got to say the Allies won. So, you know, they're doing something right. Could they have won quicker? Well, that's very easy to say with hindsight, or it's very easy to say from the comfort of an army or army group headquarters, even in 1944, that, there probably wasn't a boldness that British and Commonwealth troops had shown in the First World War in ordinary infantry. They were more cautious in the Second World War. They were more reliant on letting the artillery do the job. They were more inclined to go to ground when they came under fire than their fathers had been. But that's partly because this is the generation that had heard the stories of what happened when you didn't do that. And it worked. Artillery did grind down the German army in Normandy. It ground down some of the finest units of the German army in Normandy. And their equipment and all those advantages were not enough. Eventually the Allies broke through. It took time, it took 10 weeks, but after that then they overran. I mean, one of the ironies is that much to the opposition of some of the senior American commanders, Montgomery had had this briefing before, Overlord displaying these estimated lines of where we would reach at certain dates. And in fact, by the end, they're almost right, but the things in between haven't got there. But once the breakthrough occurs, it is exploited very well, and you have, Patton herring round to Brittany and beyond, coming east as well. But if you dropped Patton and the Third Army in Normandy in June, in place of Bradley, it's unlikely he would have done any better with the troops available in those conditions. He was able to exploit the situation that had developed because of this attritional fighting that had occurred for months before he got there. There wasn't a lot of subtlety that was available, and that becomes less and less true because, again, this is a very narrow-fronted battle. An awful lot of troops are concentrated, a lot of armour in particular in the eastern sector, but generally speaking, there isn't space. With this difficult terrain, this is very hard to break through. The sort of blitzkrieg idea just isn't going to happen. So perhaps the Allies could have done it quicker, but perhaps not. As I say, that's easier with hindsight. They do grind down the pick of the German army in the west. Now, this is a German army that's already been ground down on the Eastern Front before this happens, so you have to remember that. But nevertheless, it is the last time when you can see the Germans as a convincing and strong offensive force. The divisions that attack in the Ardennes don't do anywhere near as well and are less impressive in the first place than the ones that have reached Normandy, even though those never managed to mount too effective or too deep an attack into the Allied bridgehead. So I think there is a case to be made that many of the German units did perform a little bit better than their Allied counterparts, but that's usually because you're not quite comparing like with like. When you've got a Panzer Grenadier unit compared to an infantry battalion in the US, Canadian or British Army, it's more strongly equipped, it's got more firepower, it's got more experienced leaders than they have. It's also because the Germans lack some of the industrial might of the West, they're having to rely on individual aggression. There is a lot to be said for the tactical doctrine, the devolution of authority, allowing commanders the mission tactics, all this sort of thing. Yes, there is truth in that. There is some truth in the idea that quality could punch above its weight and could deal with a level of quantity and on equal terms, and at least, but what the Germans managed to do is hold the Allies back for longer than was expected, to their own destruction of their teeth arms. They're never really in a position after those first few days, they don't handle it well enough where they're ever likely to win. So there's something in it. There is something in the stories that NATO lapped up during the Cold War, again, that quality, that the Wehrmacht system, German doctrine had advantage in many respects. There were aspects where it was better. The Allies found a way of fighting that used their advantages and used what their conscript army could do and was willing to do and was capable of doing, in combination with overwhelming artillery to grind the enemy down. Sometimes it did more impressive things than that, sometimes it didn't, but the point was in the end it won. So I would say that some of the claims made by Max Hastings and others, Carlo d'Este, others, people like that, who very much emphasize the superiority of the Wehrmacht, go far too far. And they don't allow for many of the mediocre units that were there and that didn't last very long when they were introduced to the battle for Normandy. And some of the criticism of the Allies is exaggerated and unfair. There were units that did better, and the main point is that the Germans didn't do any better attacking than the Allies managed. And that doomed them, because without a successful offensive, they were bound to lose in the long run. They were not going to win a war of attrition. But the Normandy turns into that. It is, in many respects, a First World War battle until you have the final breakthrough. And it is slow, grinding, dominated by artillery, by small-scale assaults that don't go anywhere near. It is not tanks driving around deep penetrations of the enemy that then can be overwhelmed and and to exploit through. That doesn't happen until the enemy is so weak that they can't really stop the Allies. So, yes, there's some truth in it. On the other hand, it is exaggerated, and looking at it from a historian's point of view, it's less surprising that the Allies do things in the way they did it, and it seems to work. It doesn't mean that perhaps if you'd had the opportunity to train more, if you'd had more resources put into the army, they might well have done things differently. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The German system that had some advantages wasn't able to turn those advantages into anything like victory. And, perhaps if it had been better deployed, perhaps if it had managed to coordinate some of its offensives better, it might have posed much more of a threat. Whether it ever could have won or not, and whether if it had managed to defeat the Normandy landings, that would have changed the long-term outcome of the war, probably unlikely. But nevertheless, it's significant. So the answer is, in some respects, and some types of German units probably performed a bit better, and their equipment and their doctrine allowed them to do this than their Allied equivalents, but not enough to make a difference, not enough to win, and not enough to... The criticism of the Allies often goes too far. And again, the Allies weren't fighting a war where they wanted to accept the heavy casualties that the Germans did take. So, and already taken up to this point in the war. So, all in all, it's a sort of partial, yes, there was probably German doctrine, German tactics gave them advantages. The Allies had some advantages as well, particularly in use of artillery and weight of artillery. And when the battle became more open, they were also a more mobile army than the Germans were by 1944. Neither side had such a big advantage over the other in terms of tactics and combat that it made it easy for them. So that the attritional fighting punished the Germans as well as punishing the Allies. Probably the Allied losses were heavier, at least in the early days, but they were suffering fewer losses through prisoners than the Germans were. And particularly once you got the ordinary German infantry divisions involved in Normandy, the number of prisoners taken by the Allies every week was far, far higher, and the Germans were losing at a rate that they simply could not afford to do. At the same time, their potential offensive elements had all been ground down to the point where they were not capable of doing that. So, the Mortain offensive in August does remarkably well in the circumstances, but is still defeated. So, again, quality can only take you so far, and the advantages it gives you by 1944 are nowhere near as significant as they had been earlier. The other side has learned, your opposition has learned. So it's more to do with the context of the battle, and I think the idea was just pushed too far. But you shouldn't reject it altogether. You should be willing to accept that there were things that the Allied armies didn't do as well as might have been the case. But on the other hand, it's not reasonable to have expected them to have been good at everything. And, they did the job in the end. So no matter how you talk about this, the same as talking about, Napoleon's army and the French military system and how good it was, they still lose in the end. And there can be all sorts of wider strategic economic factors for that. But in the end, quality, leadership, these things can only take you so far and cannot beat the odds permanently in the long run. So Normandy has to be seen within context, the performance of the armies has to be seen within context. And as Max Hastings himself said later on, and does in his book Armageddon develop, many of the things that made the Wehrmacht effective in the Second World War were products of a society that you would not want to replicate. And that the Allies, democracies perhaps didn't produce quite such effective military systems in certain aspects, but overall they fought a better war, and one that brought them the victory. So let's finish with that. I'm afraid it's been interrupted by lots of phone calls where I've had to go back and other things that have happened today. So I'm afraid this has turned into an even more longer and rambling rant than usual, but hopefully it's of some interest, not just to people interested in Normandy and the Second World War, but also more generally themes of military history of the sort we tend to discuss on the channel. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.